Welcome to a new episode of Dev Bootcamp Life. This is Juan Lizarazo.
And this is Jared Potter.
And this is a podcast where we help you level up so you become the best software engineer on your team, or we help you level up so you land your first engineering job. And Jared, today we're going to discuss something that is that has come up because with my class, with my students, some of the students I have online, we are starting our final project. And one of the things that I notice always there is a pain with when they're working as a team is that their project management skills. So I realized that maybe we should put this podcast today talking about agile methodologies, but really just specific about a Scrum oriented to our Dev Bootcamp graduates, coding program graduates. So that's today's topic, Jared. With Agile, right? We have Agile, and Agile is just philosophy, right? For project management. But when it comes to software development, one that is very popular is Scrum. So Scrum is one of those Agile methodologies that a lot of companies use. All the companies I have worked for, we use Scrum. So that's something that is very relevant for our listeners to learn. So then when they start entering the industry or interviewing, they're very familiar with Scrum and they know what everybody's talking about and they're not so lost. Okay. So so let's start with Scrum, Jared. So do you think you can define, or do you know like what's Scrum? Are you familiar?
Yeah, definitely. So just to kind of give people a little bit of context here. So as Juan said, Agile development is kind of a bigger umbrella of methodology, right? And then under that umbrella is Scrum. So to be more specific, Scrum is a process of team software development. So as you imagine with a team, you're going to have a whole bunch of different people playing different roles. You'll have engineers, you'll have product managers, Scrum masters, stakeholders, and potentially QA and UI UX, all on a team together, pushing forward some sort of project. The other really important aspect of Agile is this idea of iterative development. Juan, could you perhaps expand a little bit more on iterative development?
Yeah. So one of the powerful things about a Scrum, right, is it focuses on iterative development, and that just means that you perform smaller cycles of development cycles. It could be a week, 2 weeks. I mean, something small. You build out some features, some characteristics for the software that are gonna deliver value to the customer, and then you get early feedback. So the idea of it is that you want to fail fast. For example, a customer asks you to build a button. You build a button, and instead of building the button and the whole system and the login page and everything else, no, you build a button and you deliver that, you get feedback. So you say, customer, look, this is my button. Is this good? And the customer is going to tell you, no, I want changes, because they are always going to want changes. But that's iterative development. Fail fast, fail early, and then at the end of all the project, you're going to have a project that is going to deliver the most value because you have had that constant cycles of feedback. So you code, write your plan, you code, deliver, feedback, repeat, okay? And when you repeat, it could be the same feature or a new feature, but you have that constant cycle of feedback.
So Juan, for those students that are listening, what do we compare Agile and Scrum development to that perhaps doesn't have this same kind of feedback mechanism?
There's other methodologies. I mean, I wouldn't call them agile methodologies, but there's other methodologies for software development. For example, in the 90s, I think there was one, or the 2000s, there was one called XP. There's one called Waterfall. A lot of big companies that have a more classic approach, they use Waterfall. So Waterfall just means that you define these documents and you define these requirements. First, pretty much you define everything about the project before you start writing the first line of code. But this is not ideal, because you can spend, let's say, 6 months defining everything about the project, discussing, meeting with with everybody's stockholders, everything. And then you write all these documents and then you start development. But as soon as you start development, you realize, oh, we didn't think about this. We didn't think about that. What about this, right? So it's a very slow cycle. So that's why Waterfall is not ideal because the cycles are very long. That usually with Waterfall, you don't release anything until the very end. And today with startups, right, we gotta deliver things fast. We gotta deliver often, so we cannot afford doing Waterfall. And there's other methodologies you can read about them. There's XP, and there's other agile methodologies that are specifically different to Scrum. For example, there's Kanban, right? But today we're gonna be talking. Maybe we'll talk something about Kanban. I mean, they have common ground.
Yeah, definitely. Just one bit I want to add to the waterfall methodology that you said there was just to make sure it's really clear for everybody, is that by the end of a waterfall development cycle, one of the problems can be that the product at the very end of it, because it took so long to define things and so long to develop things and whatnot, by the end of it, the product that's produced might not be the product that is actually needed or providing the most value for the customer, right? And that's why with Scrum, what we're focusing on today is targets this idea of getting constant feedback from the customer to make sure that what is being provided is the highest value.
Yeah, perfect. So talking about a Scrum for software developers, right? For the new software engineer, one of the fundamental pieces that comes to Scrum that I want to start talking about, because and we can branch out from it, is user stories. So user stories, they're our fundamental unit when it comes to project management. That's how we divide things. That's how we divide work, and we start branching out to create to establish our project, to create our estimates. So they're very fundamental, and everybody has to understand them. So a user story is just a unit of work, right? It delivers value, and it has a specific format. So Jared, can you tell us about the format for a user story?
Yeah, I mean, you're probably going to potentially find multiple flavors out there, but the idea of a user story, or the format of it, is describing what a user is able to do, right? So a user is able to go to a login page. A user is able to fill in their login credentials and click the login button. And then there's going to be kind of two results, right? Either they're going to log in and it's going to be successful, or they're going to fail to log in because it's an incorrect password or something like that. But the user story format, from what I recall, and you can correct me, is basically describing from the perspective of the user what they're doing and what happens.
And exactly, that's a user story. So user story is anything the user can do, but the user is not just a person. The user could be a third-party system. So if you remember, in one of our previous episodes, we talk about actors, right? So a user can be any type of actor, a person, a system, different roles, an admin. You define that. And the user stories have a template. So templates are good. This is the nice thing about Scrum. Scrum is a framework, and it provides these steps and templates that makes our life easy, because we don't have to think so much about things. So the template they provide to write a good user story is that you write the actor, right? The actor that is, for example, as a user, as a person, right? The actor of the system. Then you define what you want, what the actor wants, and then the value. So for example, and I'm going to talk about this, but like one of the things is like, for example, as a user, I can log in the page so that I can manage my account, or I can do my online banking, right? So the thing is like those three pieces, the actor, what the actor wants, what I want, right? And the value that it provides. The value is very fundamental, because when you have, so as a software engineer, when you have the value in a user story, instead of having a task like create a login page, if you don't understand why you are creating the login page or what's the value, you cannot fill in the gaps, right? Because if you cannot fill in the gaps, you have to ask a lot of questions about things. You cannot make assumptions. So things are going to slow down, and it's going to take you longer to build things. So that's why the value is so important. And that's a user story. The user story, right, has a body, has a description. So let's talk about that, Jared. Like what do you use usually in your user stories? Like, let's say we created in whatever system we're using, we wrote the user story. As a user, I want to log in so that I can manage my online account, right? So then what it would be next? How do we know if we have a good description there or not for that user story?
Well, it needs to be able to cover all of the necessary important details of what might need to be on the login page. There's a term called acceptance criteria. I'm not sure that's where we're kind of like going here or not, but yeah, that's a specific term of, does it meet the requirements for moving forward? One bit I just want to add to what you said a second ago, Juan, is that a lot of the times, product teams and UI UX designers can do their best to kind of define as much as they can through the user stories, and generally user stories are created as a team, but there's oftentimes little gaps that are left, and you as the engineer, because you're building it, you need to be able to fill in those gaps or have a certain intuition to close certain areas. But yeah, I think the main point is making sure that you have really clear acceptance criteria in place there.
Exactly. So in this user, we have usually like that description that says like, okay, the user can go to the login page and then it can enter the user and password, and then they will go to the home page as an authenticated user. So they become an authenticated user. So that's the description, but that description doesn't tell us a lot of things, right? It doesn't tell us like, to log in, do I log in with a third-party login application? Do I log in with Google? Do I create my own password? Do I, like, there's 100 things I could ask, right? So what Jared mentioned is so fundamental for user stories. User stories, good user stories, they must have an acceptance criteria. And remember, today's podcast is about Scrum for the software engineer, right? So we're not going to cover a lot of the pieces that are more in the project management, product owner, like all that stuff. We're talking about like your perspective, what you care about a lot, right? And you got to have an acceptance criteria. When you get a user story, the first thing you're going to check after the description is there is an acceptance criteria section. If there's not, you're going to ask for it. You're going to ask what's the acceptance criteria, because that's what's going to tell you when the story is done, right? That's the concept of done. When it says user story done, because it could be done when the code is ready and is merged, or when is it deployed, or when is it tested, or when it's accepted by the product owner, or when it's accepted by the product team, or like, there's so many ways. So the acceptance criteria helps with determining when a user story is done. And the criteria usually is just a list of concrete tasks that the system, right, must perform. So for example, there is a user and password field in the UI. There's only one login button. When clicking the login button, I'm redirected to a third-party authentication because we have a single sign-on page. Then after entering the correct credentials, I'm redirected back and automatically goes to the home page. If it is the first time I'm logging in, it's going to show the welcome page. See user story number 355, for example. Just an example, because then that welcome page is a new user story. So we can link things, but the acceptance criteria defines what this is done. So once you build the user story, you do the code, and you look at that criteria. Did I do this? Did I do this? Did I do this? Did I do that? It's done. And then usually the product team or other engineers come back and say like, oh, you didn't do the welcome page. You can say like, look, it's not in the acceptance criteria. It's actually done. Or we need to create a new user story because now it's too late. It's kind of like a contract. So that's the importance of it. Another piece that is very important for a good user story is testing notes, because usually if you have a QA team, or if you own your own QA and somebody else on your team is going to do it, another engineer, you have to have good testing notes. Use notes that you think that are relevant for anybody testing that from the user perspective. So usually testing notes, like what Jared mentioned, that is so fundamental, what you, Jared, mentioned, that is like from the user's perspective. So usually a good testing note is like, I can go to the code and I see a class defined. No, like a user note is like more like a testing note is more like, as a user, what do you see? You don't know anything about the code. And that takes me, and you can elaborate more on this, Jared, but like that takes me to this part about user stories. User stories never, ever, ever have details or implementation details. They don't tell you like, you should create a class and then you should create another class and then a service and all this stuff. A user story does not have that. That can be in the comments part of the discussion, but a user story does not go to implementation details. Why is it important, Jared, that user stories don't have implementation details? Don't tell the developer what or how to code.
Because I mean, that's really up to the engineer, up to the developer to decide, right? Or the team of developers to decide the architecture or how things are actually going to be laid out and to be coded. Everything else is meant to be kind of this, unifying message that says what it does, right? So both the product owner and can understand it, and everyone can be on the same page in that way. But the engineers can also read it and understand it. But yeah, generally you don't want the actual task, the user story, to have those implementation details unless they're kind of, like I said, Juan said, like there is a comment down below. It's good to count. I like to do that because it keeps everything organized in one place. But I'll add it on, like I said, as a comment down below. So I can keep track of it. I can reference it still there, but it's not messing up and, distracting in the description.
Exactly. And that's great, because one of the things, like when we finish a user story, right, as a software engineer, I finish the user story, usually you're going to present it to someone that is not technical, right? So you don't want to have these technical details there either. The other thing is like, because we're in this agile environment, right? We fail fast, we iterate fast. Sometimes if you think of an early tech approach, oh, you're going to use this, right? And you put it there and it's set in stone. And then you find that that's maybe not the best way to solve the problem. Then you're stuck with a technical decision you did early, and now you're invested in the wrong path, and that's going to create tech debt. So tech debt, Jared, what is tech debt? That's a very common word that we hear in the industry.
Yeah, tech debt. That's a really common term we hear. So I'll try to explain this as succinctly as I can. So tech debt is when during the software engineering process, there's some sort of shortcut potentially made, or some sort of trade-off of, hey, we're going to go with this technology or this library, or we're going to build this system this certain way. We know that it's not the best, but we're still going with it because it's kind of the best choice at the time. However, when you take that on, when you make that decision, it's a form of debt, meaning you have to kind of pay interest on it. And the form of interest is usually in the form of maintenance of the software, bug fixes, potentially updating the software, right? Whatever that means, you're paying interest on it.
That's perfect. That's perfect.
Yeah.
I could not explain it better. That's awesome, Jared. So yeah, tech debt. Now a new term that you know, and you're gonna hear that a lot in the industry. Whoever is listening out there, that's very a very important term.
Yeah, one bit I would add is I would encourage teams to, if you can, keep track of your tech debt, right? Create a list somewhere to keep track of your tech debt, and prioritize being able to add an item of tech debt to your sprints to be able to kind of keep it down, to work it down.
Perfect. So we have spent some time talking about these stories, and this was on purpose because this is like your best friend as a software engineer. Like as I mentioned, today is about Scrum for software engineers. But related to user stories, there's other aspects, right? Because the user story on its own is not very useful. But before we jump into the next item, I'm going to take a break, and I'm going to share our Twitter account, so you can reach out in case you want to get in touch, tweet at us, follow us, right? Whatever platform you're listening this on or watching this on, click the follow button. Like get in touch. We're publishing content every week.
Yeah. Everyone can find me at twitter.com/Jared Potter. That's JaredPotter. And feel free to reach out and say hello.
Yeah, we have the big follow button. Just follow Jared and then get in touch. We publish cool content there every week also. And you can follow me on Twitter at twitter.com /Juan Lizarazo. That's spelled out JuanLizarazog. And anyways, whatever platform you're on, we are putting our links there so you can follow us. I have had some people already reach out in private about like helping them like level up with things. So it's been pretty cool to get that feedback and that reception. So yeah, follow us there. We have the follow button. And yeah, so let's jump into the next item. So user stories are not useful on their own because one of the things is like usually executives, right? Or usually like higher ups, they want to know, and the customers, everybody wants to know when things are going to be done. I mean, I don't care, like you have the perfect user stories, right? So one of the things, like user stories are the unit, and usually we put them together, right? And this is kind of like, you mentioned the word sprint. So sprint is this body of work that we're going to complete in a certain amount of time. So the team defines that. So for example, usually many teams decide to do 2 weeks. So it's kind of like, okay, 2 weeks, we're going to do 15 user stories, right? Or 10 user stories. But the number of user stories that you can do in a sprint depends on the weight of the user story. So this comes to the next topic, which is estimation. If you cannot estimate, something is useless when it comes to project management, right? You gotta be able to estimate things. So there's 2 ways to estimate user stories. One is story points, right? That's very common. Well, there's different ways, but 3 common ways. User stories are estimated with story points, right? Or with hours, or with t-shirt sizes. Those are the 3 commons I've seen a lot personally, and I will talk more about this after Jared tells us about these 3, right? But personally, I like hours better. So Jared, let's talk about story points. So new concept for you listening out there. Google everything you can about that. But what is a story point, Jared?
So story points is a way of basically sizing a task, like Juan is saying, right? So is it a really large task, right? If it's a larger task, you'd give it a larger number of story points. If it's a small task that maybe you could complete in a smaller amount of time, you'll give it less points. Now, I'm intentionally vague there because every organization is going to kind of define what a story point is, ultimately is, which I think then leads into the second unit, which is hours. At the end of the day, I mean, it really is only hours that are being estimated. And just a quick acknowledgement, a lot of software engineers struggle with being able to estimate, and the way that you counter that is by estimating more, and then realizing, hey, how long did something actually take me, right? And becoming more familiar with your ability to work and going forward, right? People get stuck all the time on specific tasks, and that happens, and that's just part of the software process. But again, it's just how it goes. The third item is t-shirt sizes. T-shirt sizes is a kind of happy medium where it gives you, like, is it a small t-shirt size? Is it a large t-shirt size? Is it a medium? Is it an extra large, extra small, right? What have you. It just makes it more human understandable, if you will, like how when we're estimating tasks. And a lot of people can, relate to those a little easier.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. No, great explanation. And yeah, so the user story points, the story points, usually they're relative to a small unit of work. Let's say the team said, hey, we created a button, and that's going to be relative to the creation of a button. Is it like it's going to take double than creating a button? Then it's going to be this many story points. So it's really hard to explain relative to every team. Every company defines it differently. There's also the scale, what story points we use. Some companies like to use Fibonacci. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 9 or 10, 13, right? Something like that. I mean, I don't know if I said it right. I don't have it memorized, but usually that's written somewhere. We have the cards, right? And but the thing is, like, that's intentional, because if a story, like, let's say you're going to spend 5, right? Let's say let's say we're going to spend 5 days. Let's talk about days. Okay, 5 days, but then you say, no, it's going to take 6 days. You don't go to 6 days. You go to the next number up. So you're going to jump already to 8 or 9. I don't remember what it is, but you're not go. So that's the thing, is buckets of work, because the thing is, like, this is the mindset on that. If you have more work, right? So it's like bigger, that means there's more unknowns. And that's what Jared was mentioning. So because there's more unknowns, that means, like, usually you don't go from a 5 to a 6, you go from a 5 to an 8, right? Because there's more unknowns, so many that you will just say, like, okay, take it on the safer side. Usually with estimates, it's really hard to get it right the first few times, right? The first months, especially with new teams, new projects. But the thing with it is, like, usually we want to, under promise and over deliver. So we want to overestimate, because usually there's going to be distractions. We can say, like, hey, Jared, this story is going to take, let's say 1 point is going to take less than a day or 1 day, right? And we say it's 1 point or a few hours. But then what happens is, like, okay, Jared, you're going to start work on it. Jared just changes his status to in progress. And it's not like Jared is going to work nonstop on it, because he's like, oh, Jared, we have a sprint planning. Oh, Jared, we have these other things. Jared, we have these meetings. Oh, there's, like, all these distractions and other things going on. That doesn't mean, like, when you're programming, we don't really account for the engineer working the full day just coding nonstop, right? Because we account for meetings and other things, right? So that's why, like, estimates are hard, and that's why there's going to be bugs and things. So we add extra time. Distractions. Oh, Jared, this broke on production. This is higher priority. We accounted for it on the sprint, but you got to change that, right? So it's going to delay the development. But at the end of the day, that cycle, the sprint, is that Jared mentioned. Jared talked about a sprint. So Jared, you're going to help us define that, right? But that body of work, the sprint, right? I sort of talked about it. Once it's done, like, the whole stories that we put in there, all the buckets, let's say we can do, we have a capacity, right? Our engineers can complete 10 stories per sprint, per 2 weeks, right? 10 stories. So, or usually not stories, it's story points or hours. We can do 400 hours or something like that. We combine with the engineers, or we can do 15 story points combined, depending how we define these, right? Or then we decide that way what can fit into the sprint. And once it's defined, it's kind of like locked. And then it's a commitment, like we're sprinting together to reach the goal. And the idea is because it's good to have deadlines. So it's like deadlines the team sets to themselves, so then they can commit to work. So it's like, okay, in 2 weeks, I'm going to have this done, and we don't have it done. It's kind of like, what's going on, right? But it's good to have these deadlines, so we don't stay doing something forever and we don't know when things are going to get done. So Jared, how would you define a sprint, like, in a better way, since you brought it up, the term?
Yeah, well, I think you've been bringing up the term here. So the sprint is going to be some unit of time. Every organization is going to kind of pick their own unit of time, and yeah, it's kind of a commitment. It's saying we as the development team are going to strive to complete this work in this period of time. And like Juan said, you said it's locked, meaning that and what we're talking about is a term called scope, right? The scope of work is locked, meaning that if the product manager wants to come in and say, hey, I want to add these 3 more items, the team has to shake their head and say, no, you have to wait until the next sprint to do that, right? So it's like this agreement where the engineers aren't being sprung on new tasks, right? The engineers can focus on their work, but of course the engineers also have a commitment to try to finish their work. So what happens then, Juan, if come the end of the sprint, what happens, right? What do we do next? What if we don't finish our work?
Yeah. So if you don't finish the work, usually that's like a failed sprint, right? So we have to, usually when it's related, like remember, like Scrum is this big thing, but we're talking about like what the subset that you as a software engineer care about, right? So one of the things as a software engineer that concerns you when you finish the sprint is that you will have usually like a sprint review meeting where you have what's called the sprint retrospective. So this is kind of like another ceremony. It can be a 30-minute meeting, right? Or a 1-hour meeting, depending on the team, right? And it's usually the idea is to see like what the team did wrong, what did we do wrong, and what can we do better, and what we did right. And the idea of this is so then we can know that what we did right is kind of like, okay, let's continue doing that, because it's working for the team. And it's different for every team. All teams are different. It depends on the technology, depends on the industry, on the way the team interacts, everything. But it's like, okay, this is working for us. It's unique for us, works for us. Let's keep doing it. This didn't work for us. Let's try something different, because we want to be better on the next iteration, right? We're failing fast. We identified early the problems. Let's try to mitigate them. Let's have a plan for the next sprint. And then the next thing that comes is sprint planning. The team gets together and again, like picks new user stories that were previously groomed, and that's like more of a concern with of the product owner or the project manager or the scrum master. I mean, like all the roles that I'm not really gonna get into today, because as a software engineer, you're not so concerned about that. You're more concerned about like, hey, I'm getting work. Many engineers like me personally, I don't really care about the sprint planning process, like what work is going to be put into the sprint or not, right? Because somebody else is going to do it for me, right? I care more about like, do I have enough to work on this, right? And is it clear enough? The stories I get, are they properly groomed? So let's talk about grooming. Which is like, just grooming is the process of grabbing a user story, making sure it's in a good story user format, right? It has a value. If it doesn't have a value, you ask for it so you fully understand what's the goal. Remember, user stories are about goals, not features, right? It's not like you're going to build a button. No, the goal. What is the goal? Letting the user log in, right? Or like just an example there. And then and then you identify that you have a good acceptance criteria. If there's technical questions, you ask them. So ideally, before the sprint planning, you meet, you look at the stories and you start asking questions. So by the time you meet, it's like ready to estimate. So then goes the estimation process. The team defines the size, and then a new sprint is started, right? So that's kind of like the cycle there. But yeah, Jared, what did I miss here?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on a little bit to the sprint review and the retrospective. So, one thing I think a lot of, engineers might get discouraged by is when, quote unquote, we fail a sprint, right? But it's important to, going through this process, even just through life, is being able to distinguish, your personal self from the work that's accomplished as the team, right? Like, it's a process of not taking it too personally and always being able to realize that we're all growing, we're all making progress, we're all getting better. So even if a sprint has failed, right, it's one of two things. Either one, it was too much work that was put on to the team, right? Which then you realize that, you learn that, and then when you go into the next sprint planning, you accordingly adjust the amount of work that's being allocated, right? That's one aspect of it. Or two, the team just didn't simply work hard enough to perhaps accomplish the work, right? And during that retrospective process is an opportunity for the team. It's not just how to get to work better as a team, but it's also an opportunity to be open and vulnerable with your team to, be able to better understand why things didn't get accomplished or what things didn't go right, and how can we then change to improve them. And also, Juan, you mentioned it as well. It's like being able to celebrate the good things, right? Sprint review is meant to be a celebration of, great, look at all this awesome work that we did. Great job, and being able to congratulate each other to keep going forward. But yeah, I just wanted to add a couple bits there.
Yeah, there's some teams like to do sprint demos. So at the end of the sprint, after the review and everything, they do the sprint demo or before the review, and they show what they accomplished. Remember, because it's a user story, the user story delivers value. That means that it's something the user or a system can interact with. So it's something that is visible before without looking at the code. So that means at the end, when it's done, right, you can actually demo it and users can see it. And that's why a user story is so important, because it's highly visible. So then usually you have other people, you invite people from other groups, you can do the demo, and it feels really nice. Like, hey, I worked 2 weeks on this and now I can show it to everybody. Look, I feel like even if we fail the sprint, it's big because you celebrate that, like you finish something that you accomplished, you can show it off, right? So that's a very important part and very healthy for the teams to identify the good things and the bad things. And yeah, we're almost out of time, but one thing I want to mention, and then Jared, if you have one more thing to mention, we can do it, is that I forgot to mention about epics, right? So epics is just a term you're going to hear a lot, and it just means a body of work that is composed by user stories. So epic usually is related more to a feature. So for example, an epic, we're going to build the login system for the company. So it's a way to group projects. So let's say we have a lot of user stories everywhere to build just one system, but it's easier to divide it by domains, by groups, by sub-teams, right? Maybe we have 3 teams working on the same project, but it's like a big system, right? But we have featured teams. So an epic helps group these things. So then we can always refer to the epic, add the new user stories there to the backlog, right? So we didn't talk much about the backlog, but backlog is something more related to the product owner or the person running the team, project management. So as an engineer, I don't care much about the backlog. I care much about when the story is ready to groom, right? But backlog is another term. So yeah, Epic, go ahead and read everything you can about Epic. I'm going to be posting some links this week about some resources to improve all these things that we talked about oriented to the software engineer. And yeah, that's it for me really. Jared, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I think just the last thing is a comment on that point. So for a long time, I didn't know what it meant when people talked about an epic. So where that kind of is originating from is people talk about, like, if you think about like a larger novel, I guess like Lord of the Rings or something, people call that an epic, right? And that epic, that bigger book, if you will, is made up of a bunch of stories or user stories. So that's kind of where that term originates from.
Oh, that's
people understand.
I didn't know that.
Bit.
I didn't know that, but yeah, just like big work and yeah. So yeah, let's do our recap of what we talked about today, and let's call it a day. So we talked about Agile, Scrum, user stories, acceptance criteria, testing notes, epics, sprints, estimation, story points, t-shirt size, hours estimation, sprint review or retrospective, sprint demo. What else did we talk about, Jared?
I think you kind of covered it there pretty well, actually.
Yeah, we talked a lot about like user stories. Yeah, the format of the user story, right? The template for a user story, and yeah, or everything oriented for you, the new software engineer. There's more to it. There's so many things, entire books, other terms I didn't want to touch, but like, because this is what's going to help you become better when you're starting in the industry, getting familiar with these terms. So just go ahead and research everything you can about it and keep leveling up. So yeah, thank you for joining us today in this episode of episode 9, by the way, episode 9 of Dev Bootcamp Life. This is Juan Lizarazo.
And this is Jared Potter.
Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.
Take care.